transport ship sliced through the upper atmosphere of Zalor 9, its hull humming as turbulence shook the cabin. Cadets from across the galaxy sat in assigned seats, strapped in with magnetic harnesses that hummed with soft blue light. No one spoke. The tension was heavy, and the instructors had warned them repeatedly. This wasn't a simulation. This was the final survival exam. Real conditions, real threats, and no second chances. Harper sat near the edge of the cabin, her gaze locked on the oval window. Through the reinforced glass, she could already see the vibrant green jungle below, an endless sprawl of twisting vines, massive root systems, and towering trees with bioluminescent blossoms. The planet looked alive in a way no artificial simulation ever could. She pulled her hair back into a tight bun, more out of instinct than necessity, and adjusted the canvas strap on her gear pack. Her uniform was already stained from a previous terrain test. She didn't mind. She preferred the dirt to the pristine polish some of the alien cadets maintained. Beside her sat a tall cadet named Koran, from the crystalline world of Valoth Prime. His translucent armor shimmered faintly, reflecting the greens and purples from the planet below. He noticed Harper glancing at the window and scoffed lightly. Primitive vegetation. No structure. I don't see how this will be educational, he muttered. Harper didn't answer. She had learned early on that responding to Velothians only led to debates laced with passive insults. Instead, she focused on her breathing as the ship's descent accelerated. A voice boomed through the ship's speakers. Cadets, prepare for individual drop deployment. Each of you will be assigned a 1 square kilometer zone. No shared tools, no advanced equipment. You will build a shelter using only what the terrain offers. Structural integrity and resistance to climate conditions will be evaluated over a 40-hour period. Your drop begins in 3 minutes. The cabin lights dimmed. Mechanical arms locked each cadet's harness into place. One by one, the floor panels beneath the seats opened like trap doors, and each cadet was launched downward in a soft, controlled descent capsule. A transparent pod equipped only with a safety chute, a vitals monitor, and a single data logger. No weapons, no power tools, no synthetics. When Harper's panel clicked and slid open, she clenched her fists once, took a deep breath, and let the capsule's restraints pull her in. The pod hissed shut around her, sealing her into a silent sphere. A moment later, she felt the gravity shift as the pod was released into freefall. The jungle rushed up to meet her. The descent was fast but stable. Wind whipped around the capsule as heat shield tiles deflected the upper atmosphere friction. Harper's ears popped and her stomach dipped, but her training kept her calm. She watched the trees grow larger until individual branches and ridges became visible. At the final moment, the chute deployed with a hard snap, and the pod slowed, descending between massive alien trees with spiral trunks and leaves the size of solar panels. The capsule landed on a thick bed of moss with a soft thud. The door unsealed with a hiss. Harper pushed it open and stepped into the jungle. Immediately, the humidity hit her like a wet towel. The air smelled of plant resin, rot, and something almost citrus-like. The light above was filtered through layers of canopy, casting everything in an emerald hue. Her boots squished slightly as she stepped forward. The moss beneath her feet was springy but strong. She scanned the immediate area, a tangle of vines, thorny ferns, strange puffball plants that released clouds of spores if brushed. Small chittering creatures darted among the foliage. In the distance, a stream trickled, its surface shimmering with pinkish reflections. She pulled out her data logger. It activated with a flicker. Cadet Harper, Zone 7, it displayed. A timer began counting down from 48:00 o'clock. Her assigned build area was bounded by blue holographic markers embedded in small stakes. The professors had already mapped and measured each cadet's territory. No overlapping, no collaboration. Everyone was on their own. Harper dropped to one knee and ran her fingers through the mossy floor. The soil beneath was dense, but not waterlogged. Good for anchoring. She moved toward a fallen log, touched its surface. The bark peeled easily, and underneath it was fibrous, maybe usable for lashing. She made mental notes of everything: vine elasticity, leaf sizes, branch strength, moisture content. There was no shortage of material, but it was all wild, organic, unpredictable. That was the real test. She glanced upward as a shadow passed. Far above, she spotted another capsule descending, probably Corin's. It landed with more noise than hers, cracking a tree branch on the way down. A moment later, she saw the shimmering form of the Velathian cadet disembark. He stood tall, arms folded, surveying his surroundings like a general judging a battlefield. He didn't acknowledge Harper. She didn't wait for an interaction. She turned and made her way toward the stream, wanting to inspect it before others arrived. Water was always useful. A shelter near water was practical, if done correctly. Too close, and insects and moisture would be a problem. Too far, and hydration would become tedious. She found a spot 20 meters uphill from the stream, a slightly elevated patch of dry earth shaded by two wide-rooted trees. Between them was a natural arch of vines, already half-formed like a frame. Harper smiled faintly. The jungle had offered her a foundation. From her gear pack she pulled out the only tools allowed, a carbon handblade, a meter of cord, and a flintstone. That was it. Her first step was not to build, it was to understand. She spent the next 2 hours collecting samples, testing fibers, snapping branches, and observing how materials responded to pressure and moisture. Some vines were too brittle, others too elastic. Some leaves oozed sap that hardened into a glue-like resin. Potentially useful. She didn't rush. Unlike the alien cadets who had trained on sterile decks and synthetic environments, Harper had grown up near the Appalachians. Her grandfather had taught her how to build tree forts out of sticks and tarps. Her body remembered things her instructors never taught. The day was hot and slow. Distant sounds of construction echoed through the jungle. Some cadets had already begun. She heard mechanical voices muttering in frustration, wood cracking, ropes snapping. She didn't look toward them. She focused on the rhythm of her own preparations. Build smart, not fast. When the sky darkened into a violet dusk, Harper had already cleared her building zone, reinforced the ground with packed mud, and laid out an A-frame blueprint in her mind. The jungle had given her everything she needed. Now it was her turn to return the favor. With effort, instinct, and muddy hands. The first day had only begun. But in Harper's mind, the shelter was already standing. By morning, the jungle was steaming. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around twisted roots and hanging in threads from the canopy above. Insects the size of small stones buzzed in tight clouds, vanishing only when larger predators rustled through the underbrush. The chirping of unseen creatures blended into an eerie symphony, occasionally interrupted by a thud or crack somewhere in the dense foliage. Harper woke early. She had slept beside her gear pack, curled near the two wide-rooted trees she had chosen for shelter placement. Her clothes were damp, her hair plastered to her neck, but she felt focused. She sat up, brushed soil from her palms, and immediately resumed work on the frame. Not far from her zone, the jungle echoed with the voices of cadets already deep in their own construction efforts. She heard angry clicks, frustrated grunts, and at least one yelp of pain. Branches snapped underfoot as others paced or scrambled for better materials. The exam was pushing everyone past comfort and into instinct. And instinct, Harper knew, wasn't something you could download into your brain like Velathian programming. It had to be lived, earned, tested. She tied the last support branch into place with a vine that she had carefully stripped and dried at first light. The structure was simple but strong. An interlocking A-frame anchored into the earth at 5 separate points, reinforced with a diagonal crossbeam she had lashed using resin-thick bark. Her hands were already raw, but she didn't slow down. Rain would come soon. The clouds had been thickening since dawn. A deep metallic groan echoed from a distance. Harper paused, listening. Then she heard it, a sharp crash followed by a muffled explosion of foliage. Someone's shelter had failed. She stood, wiped sweat from her brow, and moved toward the noise, careful not to leave her marked boundary. Through a break in the brush, she spotted the wreckage of a once ambitious dome made of interlocked fronds and crystalline stalks. It had collapsed completely. Shards of some gelatinous plant substance were splattered across the forest floor, sticky and still twitching. Standing beside it, arms spread in disbelief, was Corin. His armor, which had gleamed the day before, was now smeared with green paste and torn vine. He turned and noticed Harper watching. His expression shifted from shock to embarrassment, then to defiance. "This plant matter defies any logical tensile structure," he called out, flicking a glop of sticky resin from his wrist. "It reverts under stress, loses cohesion." Harper didn't reply. She looked at the base of his structure. It had been elaborate, overly reliant on geometric precision, constructed with little understanding of how the materials behaved when wet or under weight. It was a mathematician's shelter, not a survivor's. More noise broke out to her right. Two cadets from the insectoid race of Cathari were arguing in rapid clicks. One of them was pulling a sagging canopy off a branch, while the other was repeatedly stabbing a support beam into the soil, trying to force it to stay upright. But the beam had already begun to rot from moisture exposure. As the cadet lifted it, the base crumbled in his claws. He screamed in frustration and hurled the remains into the trees. Another crash came from deeper in the jungle, followed by a flash of red light, a distress beacon flaring to signal structural failure. Someone had used a vine that secreted acidic sap once cut. It had eaten through a frame within minutes. The cadet responsible had been forced to abandon the shelter and activate emergency withdrawal protocol. Harper returned to her own zone, this time with more urgency in her pace. She felt the tension building across the test field. The jungle was consuming the unprepared. The professor's design for this exam had been cruel in its simplicity, no tricks, just the merciless demand to adapt or fail. By midday, the rain arrived. It came fast, as if the clouds had been waiting for a signal. First a low rumble, then a sudden cascade. The sound of water pounding leaves and soil swallowed everything else. Harper ducked beneath the partial frame of her shelter, pulling a wide frond over her back as makeshift cover. Her walls weren't complete, but the skeleton held firm. Rain slapped the mud hard, pooling around improperly sloped shelters nearby. From her vantage point, she saw one alien cadet attempting to dig a trench with his claws, but the walls collapsed in on themselves, turning the effort into a muddy mess. Another cadet tried to cover her canopy with flattened leaves, only to watch them fold and disintegrate in the rain. Everywhere Harper looked, there was panic. The alien cadets were trained in zero-gravity survival, starship emergency protocols, and climate-controlled desert terrain. But few had ever handled a hostile biome with no digital infrastructure. There were no AI assistants to analyze material composition, no gravity stasis fields to hold beams in place, and no antimatter torch to instantly forge shelter walls. There was only friction, fiber, pressure, and time. And time was winning. As thunder cracked overhead, a cadet from the amphibious race of Brelg stumbled past her shelter, completely drenched, his thin clothes clinging to his scaled body. He looked around in desperation and then dropped to his knees under a massive fern, trying to curl his long limbs beneath it. His gills twitched violently as cold rain soaked into his skin. Harper considered calling out to him, but she saw one of the professors watching from a hovering observation orb. Any assistance could cost her points, or worse. Instead, she knelt and pressed more mud into the wall she had started that morning. The rain helped, thickening the outer shell. She used it to seal gaps in the frame, applying it with the flat of her palm. Each motion was deliberate, guided by memory and instinct. The shelter would not be pretty, it wouldn't shine, but it would hold. By evening, when the rain finally slowed to a gentle drizzle, more beacons had flared. At least 6 cadets had failed. The jungle floor was littered with abandoned attempts, half-huts, fallen domes, shredded netting. Even Corin had retreated into a hastily built lean-to, scowling beneath a tarp of overlapping leaves that barely covered his shoulders. His pride had collapsed faster than his dome. Harper sat on a flat rock near her nearly finished frame, eating a ration bar and watching the sky darken again. The air smelled like steam and wet bark. Her arms ached. Her fingernails were caked with dirt. But her shelter stood, and she knew it would hold through the night. The jungle had tested everyone with the same conditions. It hadn't played favorites. It didn't care what planet someone came from, how rare his biology was, or how many degrees she held from off-world academies. The only advantage Harper had came from Earth, from childhood hours spent building forts in the rain, learning which sticks snapped, which branches bent, and which soil packed down strongest when wet. She finished her meal, wiped her hands on her pants, and crawled beneath her frame. It wasn't finished, but it was dry enough to sleep under. Tomorrow she would reinforce the walls, add a roof, maybe even construct a bench or raised pallet for better rest. But tonight she had a structure. Others didn't. And that difference, made only of vines, mud, and human patience, was what the examiners would remember. Morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a dense blanket of fog. Pale light filtered through the canopy, washing the jungle in a silvery glow. Harper awoke with her cheek pressed to the hardened floor of her shelter, the scent of damp earth and dried sap lingering close. Her back ached, her wrists were stiff. She had barely slept, but she didn't feel tired, only sharpened, as if every nerve had tuned itself to the rhythm of this living, breathing forest. She pushed herself up, crawled from beneath the frame, and rose to her feet with a slow breath. Her shelter had held through the night, but she knew the exam wasn't over yet. Today, she would have to prove it could do more than just stand. Across the forest, faint rustling and occasional voices stirred the silence. The rain had stopped, but the humidity clung to the air like wet cloth. Harper stretched her arms, twisted her torso to pop her spine, and then crouched beside the woven frame she had constructed the previous day. Now came the part she enjoyed the most, the shaping. The shelter had bones. It needed skin. She pulled a handful of large leaves from a bundle she had gathered before dusk. Their surfaces were thick and waxy, perfect for repelling moisture. She laid them across the roof slope in overlapping rows, carefully tucking each edge under the previous one, forming a natural shingle pattern. Her fingers worked with patience, bending the stems without snapping them, checking the direction of the veins so the water would run cleanly off the sides. Her movements were slow but practiced. As she worked, her mind drifted back to her childhood. She remembered the smell of pine needles, the feel of rope digging into her palms as she lashed branches into place in a half-finished backyard fort. Her grandfather's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Don't fight the wood. Feel what it wants to do." She smiled briefly. It made no difference to the jungle that she was thousands of light years away from those moments. The logic of the forest was the same. Wood bent, mud sealed, wind tested, and a good shelter wasn't forced into shape, it was coaxed. A low hiss caught her attention. She turned slowly and saw one of the reptilian cadets approaching the edge of her boundary zone. His name was Ralvek, from the desert world of Chardon. He was hunched forward, arms wrapped around his midsection, his eyes scanning the treetops with cautious urgency. His scaled skin shimmered faintly with leftover moisture, and his movements were uneven, favoring one leg. He stopped just short of the blue boundary marker. "Are you—" he began, but his voice cracked. Harper stood still, her hand resting on a long support branch. She studied his posture, noted the swollen joint near his knee, the slight twitch in his jaw. "You stepped in water you couldn't see," she said quietly. "Sprained yourself." Ralvek blinked, caught off guard. "How do you know that?" "Because that mud pool downhill looks solid until you put your weight into it. I stepped in it yesterday. I pulled my foot out before it twisted." He narrowed his eyes, but didn't deny it. Harper motioned toward the nearest log just inside his zone. "Sit down. Take pressure off the joint." "I'm not here for help," he snapped. Your structure. It didn't collapse." She raised an eyebrow. "No, it didn't. I watched it through the rain. Your roof doesn't leak. Your mud hasn't broken apart." She didn't speak. She wasn't sure what he wanted from her. Approval, instruction, or a crack in her confidence. Ralvik's eyes narrowed. "What did you use?" Harper walked to her supply pile and held up a strip of bark coated in a brownish substance. "This tree produces resin when you scratch the bark. I mixed it with ash from a lightning-scorched branch and spread it thin. It makes the structure resistant to moisture." Ralvik looked baffled. "You tested all that yourself?" She nodded. "I didn't guess. I experimented." For a long moment, Ralvik said nothing. Then he turned and limped back into the jungle without another word. Harper let out a slow breath and returned to her work. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but she could feel the mood across the zone changing. Cadets had started watching her. Not directly, not obviously, but she could sense the shift, the way footsteps slowed near her shelter, the way conversations paused as her roof took shape, the way occasional glances drifted toward her boundary as if hoping for permission to copy. She didn't care. Let them watch. By mid-morning, her roof was fully sealed. The water runoff followed the exact angle she had calculated. She built a drainage groove near the base to direct the excess away from her sleeping area. Then she gathered a stack of broad, flat leaves and lashed them into a mat for the floor. Mud was still tracking inside, but the mat would help keep her gear dry and her footing firm. The final addition came in the form of a windbreak wall, made from woven branches and anchored by a horizontal beam. She left one side open for airflow, but the rest formed a U-shape to trap warmth and protect against gusts. When she stepped back and examined the shelter, she didn't feel pride, just completion. It wasn't elegant, but it would outlast anything else in this jungle. From the trees behind her came a loud snap followed by a shriek. She turned and saw a young cadet with shimmering blue skin struggling beneath the collapse of her half-constructed hut. The girl was from the aquatic world of Norel, and she had tried to form a dome from stalks too brittle to bear their own weight. Harper hesitated. She knew the rules. No assistance, no interference. But this was different. The cadet was pinned beneath a split beam. Harper jogged over but stopped at the edge of the blue marker. "Roll to your side," she said firmly. "Don't try to push it. Twist first." The Norelian girl stared at her, wide-eyed but obeyed. With a grunt, she shifted her weight and rolled free, panting and clutching her arm. Harper stepped back and said nothing more. The instructors had seen it. She had offered verbal guidance, not physical help. That was still within the rules. When the girl looked up, Harper nodded once and turned away. As she walked back to her shelter, she spotted one of the floating observation drones hovering above her zone. Its lens pulsed with faint light, recording everything. Somewhere on the command ship above the atmosphere, a panel of professors was watching, analyzing, comparing. She didn't smile, but something in her chest settled. By late afternoon, her shelter was complete. The walls were woven, the roof was sealed, the floor was dry, and the structure had withstood 2 shifts in weather and pressure. It wasn't just a hut, it was a livable space. She had even added a small rock shelf for storing food and a pair of hanging fronds to keep insects out. She sat down inside, cross-legged, and looked at her hands. They were covered in scars, scratches, and dried mud. Her fingernails were cracked. A few bruises dotted her forearms from dragging logs. But she felt whole. She felt real. No one had told her what to do. No algorithm had guided her. She had built this with instinct, trial, and error. This wasn't about passing an exam anymore. It was about proving, at least to herself, that she didn't need advanced tools or elite programming to survive. She needed focus, she needed patience, and she needed to trust the voice inside her that said, "Keep going, it'll hold." As the jungle fell into golden silence, Harper leaned back against the wall of her shelter, closed her eyes, and listened, not to the sounds of cadets struggling or drones humming overhead, but to the quiet creak of branches that had been bent, not broken, into something useful. She had touched this jungle, and it had not rejected her. The wind changed around midnight. It came in a long, slow breath at first, whispering through the canopy like a warning. Then it gathered into a sharp gust that bent the treetops and rattled the woven walls of Harper's shelter. She sat upright, instinct waking her before the noise could. Her eyes adjusted quickly to the darkness. The air inside her shelter was still dry, still warm, but the sounds outside had shifted. She could hear leaves thrashing and branches groaning as the wind intensified. Somewhere distant, thunder cracked, deep and rolling, like the growl of a waking beast. She moved to the shelter's entrance and peered out. The jungle, which had felt alive during the day, now appeared haunted under the cold glow of bioluminescent fungi. The shadows were sharp, alive with motion. A cluster of vines shivered violently against a trunk to her left. Harper watched the sky above the treetops pulse white for a brief second. Lightning, far off, but approaching fast. The storm would reach them soon. She turned back inside and checked every binding in the structure. The resin-coated lashings still held firm. The roof leaves hadn't shifted. The windbreak wall was braced by a triangle of branches she'd wedged together that afternoon. She pressed her palm to the main crossbeam and felt its solid resistance. The shelter was ready, but her pulse didn't slow. She grabbed her gear pack and moved it to the most protected corner. Then she pulled a broadleaf curtain down over the entrance and secured it with a thorn hook she'd carved earlier. No light escaped now. Only the sounds of the storm outside reached her ears. She sat in the dark, knees tucked to her chest, breathing slowly. This wasn't like the first night. That night had tested her patience. Tonight would test her work. The first wave of rain struck like a slap. It came not in droplets, but in sheets, wide, heavy curtains of water that pounded the canopy and poured down like a cascade. Leaves rustled violently, branches cracked under the pressure. Somewhere to her right a loud snap echoed, followed by a splash and a startled scream. A tree had fallen. She closed her eyes and listened to the vibrations in the ground. They settled quickly. The danger had passed, but the storm had only begun. Her shelter held. Water hit the roof with the sound of fists, but the angled leaf shingles redirected the flow down the walls. Mud rose at the base, but the trench she had dug caught the runoff. Inside, the floor remained dry. The mat she'd constructed lifted slightly at the edges from the rising humidity, but the shelter itself didn't move. It breathed like a living thing, flexing but not breaking. She smiled in the dark, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Then came the second test. A blast of wind roared through the jungle, flattening the smaller trees and tearing through the upper branches. Harper heard the howling pass above like a giant beast searching for weakness. A chorus of alarms rose from across the zones. Panic triggers being set off, structures failing, cadets calling for emergency review. One by one, red lights pulsed through the jungle. She counted at least 5, then she stopped counting. She focused instead on the tension in her shelter. The frame shook, the wall creaked, but the joints flexed instead of snapping. She had built the structure with give, nothing rigid enough to shatter under pressure. Her instincts had told her to let the jungle move, not resist it. Now that decision separated her from those who hadn't listened to the wind when it spoke. For over an hour she stayed seated, monitoring each sound, each vibration. She checked the mud pack seal at the base of the back wall with her fingers and found only moisture, no seepage. She adjusted the top frond of the roof where it had slightly shifted and stuffed a folded branch underneath to reinforce it. Her hands worked silently, deliberately. She didn't panic. There was no fear left in her, only focus. When the wind finally began to calm, she felt it like a tide retreating from shore. The pressure in the air lifted. The pounding of rain slowed to a gentle patter. She unhooked the curtain and stepped outside into the misty darkness. The jungle looked different now, stripped, torn, humbled. Leaves lay scattered like debris from a crash. Whole trees leaned at odd angles. Shelters had collapsed across the zones. Some cadets sat beside the wreckage of their huts, soaked and exhausted, waiting for the sunrise. In the middle of the chaos, Harper stood alone beside her standing shelter. Water streamed from the rooftop in clean lines. The windbreak still stood. Her structure had survived untouched. She heard a low, mechanical hum above and glanced up. One of the surveillance drones hovered directly overhead, its blue light trained on her and her shelter. It floated in a slow circle, recording everything. Then it rose silently and disappeared through the fog. As the sun broke through the eastern canopy, casting golden rays through the trees, the jungle slowly came alive again. Insects chirped. Branches groaned under new weight. Harper stepped forward, stretching her shoulders, and walked to the small water basin she had carved into the earth near her shelter. It had filled during the storm. She cupped her hands, rinsed her face, and shook the water from her skin. Around her, cadets emerged from their zones like survivors from a battlefield. Corin limped across the mud, his once glorious armor now dulled and cracked. He carried a broken support beam over one shoulder. He glanced at Harper's shelter and paused. His jaw tightened. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, once, and moved on. Another cadet approached. A young girl with pale skin and dark eyes, shivering as she clutched a torn piece of her canopy. She stopped just outside Harper's boundary. "Did yours hold?" she asked softly. Harper looked at her and then at the shelter. "Yes," she answered. "It held." The girl nodded and walked away slowly, barefoot in the soft mud. A few minutes later, an announcement crackled through every data logger. Storm conditions registered. Structural integrity review in progress. Cadets with complete shelters, remain at your zones for inspection. Cadets with collapsed shelters, report to fallback zones immediately. A team of 3 pilots. Harper watched a group of drones descend into the jungle, moving from zone to zone, scanning the shelters with long beams of light. One reached hers and hovered silently, slowly circling her work. Then it let out a low tone. Confirmation of success, and hovered away. She exhaled. The jungle had thrown its worst at her, and her shelter had not only survived, it had shielded, held, endured. She had built something with her hands, her patience, and her earthborn knowledge that even the wildness of Zalor 9 could not break. She sat again on the stone near her shelter and allowed herself a single moment of stillness. Her fingers ached, her back was tight, but something deeper inside her had shifted. She didn't feel like a cadet anymore. She felt like a builder, a survivor, a quiet force moving through a loud, chaotic world. The storm had tested the jungle, the shelters, and the cadets. And it had spoken one simple truth. The one who listens to the land, who understands what it gives and takes, she is the one who endures. The morning after the storm shimmered with strange quiet. The jungle was still soaked, but the tension in the air had shifted. The usual symphony of chirps and rustles had returned, but softer now, as if nature itself had taken a breath. Harper sat cross-legged outside her shelter, her hands resting on her knees, watching the filtered light dance through the rising mist. Her body was sore in every place imaginable, wrists, shoulders, calves, even the arches of her feet. But beneath that soreness lived something heavier, something solid. Certainty. She had done what she came here to do. Her data logger chirped. The glowing interface displayed a message. Final evaluations begin in 1:00:00. She exhaled. 1 hour left. One final round of review before the results were tallied and decisions made. She stood slowly, stretched her arms above her head, and scanned the perimeter of her shelter. Everything was still intact. The water runoff channels had worked. The structure stood straight. The walls hadn't bowed. Even the mat floor inside remained dry. There wasn't a single sign of collapse, leakage, or displacement. It wasn't perfect, but in this environment, perfect didn't survive. Resilient did. Across the jungle, other cadets were busy trying to salvage what they could. A group to her right attempted to reassemble a partial wall using leftover stalks, even as mud sucked at their feet. Some others were simply sitting, wrapped in wet cloth, waiting for the end, resigned to their grades. Koran, though silent, had taken to sweeping the area around what little remained of his original dome. He wasn't rebuilding anymore, just preserving dignity. When his gaze met hers, he held it a second longer than before, then returned to his task. Professor Morin, a high-ranking evaluator from the Galactic Survival Institute, arrived at Harper's zone just before the hour ended. He floated down inside a gravlift harness, arms clasped behind his back, face unreadable. His reptilian eyes scanned the shelter with slow precision. He wore no expression of approval or disapproval, just pure assessment. 2 drones hovered behind him, recording every movement, every detail. "Cadet Harper," he said at last, stepping carefully across the dry trench that bordered the shelter. "This structure is yours?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Fully built, without assistance?" "Yes, sir. No tools beyond the standard issue, no external support." He walked a slow circle around the shelter, tapping lightly at the woven walls, peering beneath the roofing layers, testing the flex of the mud-reinforced corners. His boots didn't sink. She watched him trace a hand over the resin-sealed bindings. "Did you analyze the tree species before using this sap?" "I field-tested it," she answered. "Scraped small strips, observed reactions over time. Added scorched ash to reduce surface friction and increase resistance to slippage during heat expansion." He tilted his head slightly. "You improvised a formula?" "Yes. The standard vine lashings were too reactive when wet." Morin gave a quiet hum, neither approval nor disapproval, and continued his inspection. He knelt beside the floor mat and tested the placement. Then he stepped inside without asking, sat cross-legged where she had sat earlier, and tilted his head back. "Dry," he noted, "despite the storm." "Yes." He remained silent for a while, just sitting inside her shelter, hands on his knees, eyes closed. She wasn't sure if this was still part of the evaluation or something else. After a long pause, he spoke without opening his eyes. "This reminds me of a field structure I once saw on Erithil IF," he said slowly. "Built by a tribe with no access to tools. Just their hands, their traditions, and an understanding of their land. Their homes withstood acid rain and ground tremors. Do you know what the difference is between a shelter and a structure?" She hesitated. "A structure stands. A shelter protects." He opened his eyes and stood. "Correct. Most cadets built structures. You built a shelter." She didn't reply. His words sat heavy in the air, but they felt earned. Morin stepped out and looked at her directly. "The final results will be processed by nightfall. But regardless of outcome, remember this. Survival is not about strength. It's about understanding your limits and the land's generosity. You showed both." With that, he turned and activated his lift, rising silently into the canopy. The rest of the day moved slowly. Cadets returned to their drop points. Some packed up their equipment with robotic motions, unsure whether they'd done enough. A few whispered about Harper's shelter as they passed by, some curious, some quietly envious. She kept her focus inward. Praise didn't matter, neither did rumors. What mattered was the feeling she couldn't shake. The jungle had accepted her. That was worth more than any number or rank. At sunset, a chime echoed through every data logger. A voice followed, cold and direct. "Final evaluation complete. Cadets, prepare for extraction." A series of translucent beams shot down from above, forming shimmering vertical corridors that hummed with energy. One by one, cadets stepped into the light and vanished upward toward the orbiting carrier. Harper didn't rush. She took one last walk around her shelter, touched the edge of the crossbeam, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she entered the beam and let it carry her upward, away from the jungle floor. On the carrier, the atmosphere was bright and metallic, a sharp contrast to the earthy dampness of the surface. Cadets were gathered in rows, some standing with forced confidence, others slouched in fatigue. Screens hovered above the assembly area. When the final cadet arrived, the central panel blinked to life. Commendations. Top 3 performance scores. A pause. Third, Cadet Ralvek. A thin cheer followed. Ralvek stood, stunned, then nodded once, composed. Second, Cadet Corin. Even more surprise rippled through the room. Corin blinked, then offered a slow, almost grudging bow of his head. First, Cadet Harper. No one clapped, no one jeered. It was silent. Too silent. But then someone began to nod. Then another. Then Corin stepped forward and raised his hand in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. Others followed. No fanfare, just respect. Professor Morin appeared on the stage. His tone was flat, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "Let this serve as your lesson. The galaxy is full of technology, of shortcuts and systems. But in the end, survival belongs to those who listen, who build with what exists, not with what is imagined." Cadet Harper did not command the jungle. She cooperated with it. He stepped down. No more needed to be said. As the cadets filed out toward their debriefing chambers, Harper paused at the corridor entrance. She glanced at the viewing window. Far below, the green canopy of Zal 9 stretched like an ocean, glittering beneath the stars. Somewhere down there, a shelter still stood. Her shelter. She smiled, not because of victory, but because she had done something real, and the jungle had remembered.